There are entire Resident Evil games that were fully made and then just deleted. We're talking about a version of Resident Evil 2 that was so bad they scrapped the whole thing. A version of Resident Evil 4 with literal ghosts and a full Resident Evil game running on a Game Boy. Starting with the one that was basically done.
Resident Evil.
This is Resident Evil for the Game Boy Color, and somehow it almost released. In the late 90s, Capcom tried to put the entire original Resident Evil onto a Game Boy Color, and this wasn't just an idea, the game was nearly finished. We're talking full mansion, enemies, puzzles, even cutscenes, on a handheld from 1998. It was being developed by Hotgen, and somehow they actually made it work. But then Capcom looked at the final build and cancelled the entire thing, not because it was broken, but because they thought it wasn't good enough, which is insane when you actually see it running. Because yeah, it's not perfect, but this is a Game Boy Color. You can tell who's who, zombies actually look like zombies, and the game is fully playable. And as impressive as that is, this wasn't even the most interesting cancelled Resident Evil project, because the next one completely changed what Resident Evil was supposed to be.
Resident Evil 2.
This is Resident Evil 1.5, the original version of Resident Evil 2 before it got completely scrapped. And this wasn't just some early concept either. This version got so far into development that it was basically done. They were close enough to release that Capcom had to make a really expensive decision: release it or restart the entire game. In this version, the story was already very different. Leon is still a rookie cop, but instead of arriving in Raccoon City for his first day, he's already in the police station when the outbreak hits, so the entire game starts with him trapped inside chaos immediately. Leon wasn't alone, he had Ada and Marvin supporting him, but Marvin wasn't just a background character like in the final game, he actually had a much bigger role, almost like a co-survivor trying to escape with you. This version of the story was way more focused on group survival instead of isolation. And then there's the biggest change in the entire game. The main female protagonist wasn't Claire Redfield. It was someone completely different, Elsa Walker. And she wasn't just a placeholder character either. She was a fully written protagonist with her own identity in this version of the story. Instead of being connected to Chris or the Star's storyline, Elsa was just a college student who came back to Raccoon City during the outbreak, which makes her situation way more grounded. She's not trained, not military, not prepared at all. She's just trying to survive and escape a city that's already collapsing around her. At one point, she even teams up with characters like John and Sherry to plan an escape, which makes this version feel more like two separate survival stories happening at the same time, instead of the tight connected narrative we got in the final game. And then she was gone, rewritten, replaced, and turned into Claire Redfield in the final version. Even the enemies were completely different. Zombies in this version were way tougher. There were also supposed to be enemies called web spinners that would hide in ventilation shafts and ambush you when you got close. And then there were enemies that never even made it close to release, like a man spider creature and infected gorillas, which just show how experimental this version really was. After something like Resident Evil 1.5, you'd expect the next cancelled version of Resident Evil 2 to be just as ambitious, maybe even bigger, but this one goes in the complete opposite direction. This is a cancelled version of Resident Evil 2 made for the Game Boy Advance. It was already kind of insane that RE2 even fit on the Nintendo 64, considering the original PlayStation version took 2 discs to run, and then after that they tried to compress it even further and getting it running on a Game Boy Advance. Now, this version only ever got a small playable demo, just the beginning section of the game, and it's basically just RE2 but with way less pixels. And honestly, it's actually kind of impressive. You can still recognize everything, the layout, the enemies, the atmosphere. It's all there, just heavily stripped down. But that's also exactly the problem. It was already a miracle that RE2 worked on the N64, and then trying to compress it even further into a handheld just pushed it way too far. But not every cancelled Resident Evil was about shrinking the game down. This is Resident Evil 0, originally planned for the N64 and built as a full prequel to the entire series. Instead of focusing on compression like the Game Boy Advance version, this one was trying to expand the timeline, exploring what happened before the mansion incident and how the outbreak eventually began. The biggest idea in this version was a system where you could instantly switch between two characters. But eventually, it became clear that the Nintendo 64 just wasn't enough. Even with all the ideas they had, the game was simply too big to finish properly on that hardware. So Capcom restarted development, this time moving RE0 to the Nintendo GameCube, a system that could finally handle what they were trying to build. And for the first time, the project could actually run the way it was intended. But around the same period, another experiment inside the Resident Evil franchise was starting to take shape. This is Resident Evil 3.5. At this point, this was an early version of what would eventually become Resident Evil 4, but instead of the over-the-shoulder action we got, this version leaned heavily into psychological horror. Rooms wouldn't stay the same. You'd enter an area and it would suddenly shift into something darker, more distorted, like the environment itself was breaking apart. And then there's the Hook Man, a tall, distorted enemy with a hooked arm that would appear in scripted encounters, and completely changed how the game felt. But there was a problem. The GameCube couldn't handle it. The system struggled to load multiple versions of the same room, and the whole concept started falling apart technically. So this version was scrapped as well, and Capcom went back again. This time to completely rebuild Resident Evil 4 from the ground up. Those were all the unreleased Resident Evil games I could find. There was also a PSP game announced at one point, but it never went beyond the announcement stage. And looking back at all of them together, you can kind of see how the series kept finding itself over and over again. And maybe the most interesting Resident Evil games are the ones we never got to play. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching.